Welcome to this quick recap of some of the main points to think about regarding the readings regarding physical and cognitive development in adolescence. The readings for this unit were Chapter 11 in Burke. And after completing the readings, I'm just hoping that you'll be able to describe some of the major trends and influences on physical and cognitive development in this age period, and also think about how those and theory apply to how you do your work or your personal experience. As you do your reading and think about the milestones that occur in adolescence in terms of physical development, some things to think about and which change with some predictability are the size of children in adolescence. Obviously, they grow a lot. It's pretty amazing how much weight they gain and how much height they gain and how rapidly that happens in this age period. Another interesting thing to think about is the proportions of their bodies and how they change. And our text talks about how boys and girls' bodies shift in their proportions. There's a little reference here to Sheldon, who's an older researcher who did some interesting research in the past, not that long ago, about body proportions and how they relate to psychological characteristics of people. I just thought you might find that interesting. He talked about body forms called endomorphs, mesomorphs, and ectomorphs, and he thought that related to personality. A lot of his ideas have been disproven, but it's interesting to think about how psychology and theory has evolved over time and how physical development has influenced what we think about psychological and even interpersonal development. It's just kind of a good way to illustrate how the different domains are interrelated and how those theories and ideas have changed over time with good research and by observing trends. The last topic here is to think about when you're, well, one of the last topics to think about when you're reading about physical development and trends in that is called a secular trend. And secular trends are when the timing of certain milestones change over different time periods. So, for example, menstruation. Girls might menstruate at different average times over different eras in history. And there are reasons for that. They might be environmental and they might be biological. For example, maybe nutrition has changed how girls at what point girls reach menstruation. But it's interesting to note that what's normal in one time period might not be what's normal in another, and to try to think about how theories can explain those differences. Our text also does a nice job illustrating some of the differences between development in boys and girls, so I won't go into them all here, but look forward to hearing your reactions to them on our discussion forum and in your papers that you write. Basically, environmental and biological influences impact boys and girls and cause them to mature at different rates, and those maturational changes can have different impacts on their development in all the domains, as we've said. So just pay good attention to Burke's accounting for those differences between boys and girls, because obviously adolescence has different specific changes that happen in their bodies and also that impact them socially and in other ways too. Puberty is probably the biggest change that people associate with physical development in adolescence, and there are definitely differences between individual rates of attaining puberty. So among girls, they don't all mature at the same time, nor do all boys mature at the same times. And there are also group differences. Burke does a nice job outlining the trends and how those differences can impact individuals. Some things affect the attainment of puberty. Some are physiological, things about our body, our hormones, and so forth that dictate when that happens. And then the timing of when that happens can also impact us in terms of how we feel about ourselves, how we relate to others, and obviously what can happen to our bodies if we are capable of becoming pregnant and things of that nature or not. Burke does a good job describing how maturing early or late can affect boys versus girls, and there are some advantages to maturing early, and there are also some disadvantages. So think about those, and I'm sure as you work with your students and think about your own experience, you're familiar with people who did mature early or late and saw some of the repercussions for that, whether they got maybe more attention from the opposite sex, more pressure because they looked older, things of that nature. So there can be drawbacks to maturing early or late. So it's interesting to think about, and to think about it not just anecdotally, but based on what the research says. So we all have our anecdotal historical experience from ourselves and our friends, but to think about the trends over bigger groups in society is quite interesting. In terms of cognitive development in adolescence, I just wanted you to think about the theories we've reviewed, and especially Piaget's theory, in that it's kind of an easy one to apply to this age period, because at this point, at the age of 12 and beyond, children are entering adolescence and starting to develop formal operational thinking. As we know, not everyone gets as deeply into formal operational thinking or as competent at it as others, but they begin to be able to do some hypothetical deductive reasoning, make propositions in their thinking, and think abstractly. So as you read, think about what the research says about how these skills develop and why they might not develop as well as in some people as others, and what those things mean for us psychologically. How do we understand ourselves, and how do we fit into society when we start to think in these formal operational ways? Because it does give teenagers or adolescents a whole different perspective on the world. They're not so self-centered and egocentric anymore. They're starting to look at the big picture, and one of the ways it changes them is it can make them very idealistic, which also opens them up for frustration when their ideals aren't necessarily met in the society they find themselves within. So think about the psychological repercussions of changing the way we think at this age period. And we've been thinking about how kids get to this point, and then once they reach this point, how can they use those skills as they become adults and more independent citizens. I guess that's your task as teachers, to think about how to hone those skills and then help the kids use them to fit into society and improve it. All right. So finally, in reading all these trends, theories, how they impact individuals and groups, what's the goal for us is to use that information in the classroom to be better teachers and help our students be adjusted and successful. The next page talks about some health and psychological issues to think about based on the readings. So here's just a tiny list of all the issues that adolescents face, and obviously not every issue they face is negative, but these are some difficulties or challenges they might experience, and they relate to their development in terms of their physical development, how that affects them socially, the way they can think, the way they can solve their problems, and the support they have around them, which includes teachers. So there's a little list here. I don't need to read it to you, but you can see examples. Things like anxiety, physical problems, social problems, health problems. All those things can impact teenagers and can be related to the things they're going through because they are teenagers, and the pressures that society puts on them at that time. That's a little kind of segue into thinking about Erickson's model, because he believes that psychosocial conflicts are what need to be resolved at every age period. So these kids, they're not developing in a vacuum. They're in a social context. So you can see where things like dating, issues with that could come about because they're in a situation where their bodies are maturing, they're psychologically interested in the opposite sex, and if they're in a situation with peers of the opposite sex or peers they're attracted to, dating could become an issue. So just to think about these physical issues brings up issues of society and the context in which teenagers or we find ourselves. Okay, so just as you're reading about these types of issues or the theories and thinking about how these theories relate to these types of issues, I want you to just think about, are these natural or biological issues, or are they because of societal influence or environmental influences, or maybe they're influenced by both. By now you've probably heard Burke say enough times that a balanced perspective is the best one. There's usually some nature influence and some nurture influence on whatever aspect of development we're talking about or thinking about. I just added a blurb to this newer file about some current issues that impact adolescents. Over the past few decades, we've had so many changes in technology. Kids are using, as we know, cell phones, and there's cyberbullying and all kinds of instant messaging apps and things that are definitely impacting them in terms of their psychological and social adjustment, and then their consequent emotional adjustment, for better and worse. Of course, as we talked about secular changes, there are always societal and economic changes going on, and those could change how kids develop. Anecdotally, we're looking at sending our first child to college, and of course that brings questions about money to the forefront, and there are lots of changes. It's just really fascinating to look at how the cost of college has changed since I was a teenager. So just things like that, and they could be related to any topic, but that's just an anecdotal one. And of course, there are family issues and changes, and all these things can affect kids for the better or worse. We've seen many more families with divorces happening, different kinds of family configurations, and of course political influences that change how families are able to succeed or not in our society. So things to think about as you're reading and working with your students. So I hope the chapter helps you come up with some good ideas for helping your students. And if you deal with some of these issues on this page, I hope you find some ideas to support those students that are experiencing them. There's one more page after this. So as you reflect about your readings about physical and cognitive development in adolescents, which as we noted affects their social and emotional adjustment too, one thing that comes kind of to my mind is, well, what's our role as helpers? As teachers, of course you're a mentor and a model for your students, and sometimes you can get close to them and even feel like a friend, but of course as teachers you need to have some boundaries there. And part of keeping those boundaries in mind is taking care of yourself and your students and knowing how involved to get or not to get, which leads to the last point, making sure you have access to good resources to help the teenagers or adolescents that you work with, making sure you're in communication with families, school supports, and community supports as needed, as opposed to trying to take on their problems by themselves or possibly crossing a boundary that could cause problems in terms of teens misinterpreting your relationship with them and so forth. So I just wish you all luck in being, I didn't mean to have my screen look like that. I wish you luck in establishing healthy boundaries with your students and helping them with the dilemmas and issues they face as they develop. And I hope the chapter was helpful for you. All right, great. You can head to the unit and make sure your assignments are completed and have a great week. Thanks.